Hi, I'm Dr. Grove Higgins, and I'm sitting down with John Sinclair. He's a CPT as well as a strength conditioning coach and a medical exercise specialist at the National Personal Trainers or National Strength Conditioning Association's Personal Trainers Conference in Baltimore here. He just gave a fantastic presentation on strength training using different techniques and such, specifically the VIPR PRO, which he has been helping to develop over some time here. Could you give us just a little education on why you think differently about exercise than, say, most of the industry when it comes to strength conditioning, training skill in particular, and how that's impacted how you train versus most of the industry?
Right. It's funny, where I grew up in small town Saskatchewan in Midwest Canada, right? Mm-hmm. And where I grew up, we were out playing all day long, right? And so I'm from a town of 300 people. So in a town of 300 people, you have to entertain yourself somehow, right? And so sport was always something that entertained me, and I was always out playing with my friends, and whether I was a kid, and then when I was in high school, I was competitive in 8 different sports. Played hockey and baseball were 2 of my bigger ones. Went off to school and went to the University of Alberta, got my phys ed degree there, tried to crack the hockey team, didn't quite make it, but stayed playing junior hockey, and then playing baseball in the summer with the senior baseball team back home. But when I wasn't playing sports, I was on the farm or helping either my dad at the grain elevator or my stepdad out on the farm. And I didn't spend as much time on the farm as some of the other kids in the community did, but it was enough time to realize that real strength comes from the tasks that we do on any given day. So if you were to look at my brother, who's a framer now, right? So he has tremendous tensile strength in his left arm as he's operating a hammer with his right.
Specialized.
You got it, right? And so we are products of our environment. And what got me particularly interested in working with VIPR PRO was my good friend Michelle Delcourt, who invented the tool, was also living in Edmonton at the same time I was. He was training hockey players in one facility, I'm training hockey players in another facility. We're both going about our traditional way in which we were taught about strength training, even though he was from an Alberta farm and I was from a Saskatchewan farm. We were being taught that this is how you train athletes. Ironically, athletes kept coming to see us saying every year they want to get stronger. They want to get stronger. They want to get stronger. Sure. We'd look at their data and go, you're getting stronger. And they're like, yeah, but we're getting knocked off the puck. I'm like, interesting. So what you're telling me is that squats, deadlifts, bench press, power cleans aren't transferring to your sport. And they're like, well, I guess so, because I'm still getting knocked off the puck. Who's knocking you off the puck? The farm kids. And we're like, here's 2 farm kids. They should know that instinctually, but that education's been pushed away from us. So what we started doing is Michelle and his other co-inventor, Simon Bennett, who's now the director of performance for the Edmonton Oilers, they started talking differently about strength training. I knew it inherently, but it was coached out of me, right, through our education systems, which was, at the time, that's when functional exercise kind of became the thing, right? So we're loading you in different directions, different vectors, hitting different tissues in different ways, using different implements. And then we started looking back, well, this is stuff the Eastern Europeans have been doing forever. They weren't only just doing power cleans, they were doing explosive jumping things, they were doing sprint work, they were doing all these things that we kind of got away from and started to only load people in the vertical direction or the sagittal direction. And so we've lost that thought process of how we would develop an athlete with task-specific movement. Because if you're a shot putter, you throw a shot, and then you're off, the stuff you do off of that is going to be, I might do some of my linear pulls or explosive kind of stuff, right? So what we did is we went, well, imagine if there was a device that could load you in task-specific ways, such as skating, but would also allow you to inherently increase your tensile strength, like warding and battling and doing all the things that we have to do in all chaotic multi-directional sports. Because the sports that we play are not going up and down,
Right.
right? And they're not going just this way, and it's happening with different speeds, at different directions, and sometimes loaded, sometimes not loaded, right? And so we wanted to create something like that, and by happenstance, an athlete knocked over a piece of rubber flooring that was all taped up in a cylinder, knocked it over, guys go and pick it up, and like, wait a minute, this is something I can actually load in different directions just by tilting a big heavy piece of rubber.
Right.
And then they're like, oh, imagine if we could actually build a tool out of this, and what if we put handles in it, right? And they're like, could you imagine all the things that they did? And then that started the idea of developing this tool called VIPR. And it's now, since I think that was around 2007, 2008, and now it's developed into what we call VIPR PRO, which is our second manufactured product or iteration of it, where we enhanced it based on, we've used it now for 7 or 8 years, now we make that tool even better. And so we added some things to it, made it more robust, a stronger piece of equipment, put some different bevel handles to the top of it so you could actually do some grip strength and have some leverage on twisting and turning it. Added a textured surface to it so you get the tactile sensation of using the tool. So there's a lot of cool things that we did with the tool itself, but what we had to do to make that tool relevant was we actually had to develop a different concept of training. And that's where we coined the term loaded movement training. And loaded movement training came up with this idea of training movement strength instead of muscular strength.
Right, and I definitely want to get on that, right? What's the difference between movement strength versus muscular strength?
Well, muscular strength as we know it typically is our goal is trying to create isolation, overcoming an object, right? And training it in isolation. So the easiest way to say it is I'm creating concentric strength of a tissue. I'm strengthening myself to be able to move an object with the enhancement of shortening a tissue. So loaded movement training is actually about keeping those tissues in an isometric action, but creating movement at the same time. And the reason why we do that is concentric actions are the most economically expensive in terms of ATP and energy that we use in any activity.
Sure.
In sport, you don't want to be expensive. You want to be economical, right?
Yeah.
I don't want to use energy.
Right.
And especially I don't want to use energy at the cost of a joint. Because when a muscle contracts, it pulls the joint closer together. So the two bones approximate as soon as I create muscle contraction. So the goal would be well, what if I could pre-position load, like I would be doing in sport, and then also move at the same time?
Right.
So the body inherently in the nervous system has to go, well, in order to hold this here, I can't compress that joint. I'm not under compressive load. In fact, I'm under isometric load. Isometric load will keep that joint centrated. Now I move around that load, which is what we do in sport.
Right.
And so the goal then is, and the idea behind all of it is, if I identify with that being a concept, then that helps me with my programming. So I could say, well, if I want to do compressively loaded activity under a barbell or dumbbells, and I move in the vertical or sagittal direction, we'll call that loaded linear training. And then if anything that happens in the frontal plane or transverse plane under load or an external resistance, we're going to call it loaded movement training, right? And then I could also do it without load. So now we've got unloaded linear training, and I've got unloaded movement training. So now I've got 4 quadrants here, and that became our concept of 4Q programming. And that allowed us to be able to go, well, I'm going to do one of these, one of these, one of these, and one of these. And then now I've got balance in my training programs. Instead of, if we look at a typical training program, right, you write out all the exercises you do for your clients, I guarantee you 90% of it's up in that loaded linear direction, right? Which is the antithesis of what sport is, right? Sport happens on the right side, multi-directional, hits all facets, some loaded, some unloaded, right? And so now we say, well, if I'm developing programming for longevity for my clients, whether they're young kids or they're pros and they want to enhance their career, or if it's life after sport, now we've got a model to create sustainability. Because what's happening currently is I'm seeing kids that come in to ask to get stronger and I need to be a better athlete, and they lack the most basic movement skills, or let's say this, they lack movement abilities that need to translate into movement tasks, which need to translate into sport-specific tasks, which need to turn into sport-specific variability. And that variability creates the longevity of sport.
Right.
And so our goal now is to put them on a roadmap of how do I balance this out. The current trends that we have in the strength and conditioning community will not allow that to be foreseen.
Right. So you think that your past, working on the farm type thing, it in general trained the universal movements that you then used in your sport and then had to rediscover to train people, and now currently to us moderns that don't have that experience?
Yeah, I think what we're doing now is kids don't do chores like we had to. Kids don't get the opportunity to play a variety of sports and just go self-discover themselves, right? And so for us, running around town and doing whatever the hell we want made us better athletes. Because think about it, we learned how to run, we learned how to climb, we learned how to jump, we learned how to move over obstacles. We were able to self-discover basic movement abilities that now are trying to be structured in how they're taught. And now physical education is disappearing. So all those things that we used to learn, when we had physical education as a kid, it was you had to learn all those movement abilities. And then for whatever reason, something shifted and it had to be about learning sport skills first. Right? So you got kids that can't run, but they're asked to dribble a ball.
Right. Or be very specific in their sport application of it.
Right. Yeah. And so now parents are getting kids into sport. I'm in South Florida now. So I moved from Canada to South Florida, and it's a baseball and tennis mecca. Right? And so these tennis kids are out on the court, some of them are homeschooled now, out on the court 4 to 6 hours a day in 95-degree Fahrenheit temperatures and being asked to train sport specifically, but they lack the most basic movement abilities. So when they come to see me, that's the first thing we do, is we have to ascertain, can they even move from point A to point B mechanically efficient? And that translates all the way to the pros. I have colleagues at the professional level that are strength and conditioning coaches that say to me, John, a professional athlete can make real ugly movement look really good. Right? And because mechanically they're actually a disaster because they've become sport specific, right?
Yep.
Whereas all the pro athletes that were in the late 80s and early 90s, most of them played multiple sports, right? And so they didn't need an off season to get strong, right? They were strong because they had structured play to begin with, and they had great movement abilities, and then those movement tasks that they coupled together were a combination of playing all kinds of sports. And that's the problem that we're running into now. So from a strength training standpoint, I don't have the ability to load these kids until they can demonstrate any of those movement abilities. And then those movement tasks. We have tennis kids that can't catch a ball. They can hit the hell out of it, but they can't catch it, right? So why would I put anything in your hands if you can't even catch anything, right? And so we have to think, let's look at what we're actually doing from a long-term athlete development standpoint. And that's what kind of my path is on right now, is taking every sport, breaking it down, and showing how to create this concept of programming for every sport on the planet.
Yeah.
That's kind of where my passion lies right now, and that's what I spend my spare time when I'm not coaching people, is building these programming systems.
Yeah, that's cool. That's cool. Last question, and it's a couple multifactorial pieces. Structural strength versus strengthening the nervous system and its relationship to injury. Because eventually what we're coming down to is you're talking about long-term athletic development and sustainability. And you need to have both of those things, but how do you build those things in conjunction with each other? Which one do you build? Which one is lacking in most people, and where does somebody start?
Right. So if we look at, there's 3 lenses that I look at it through. One is the nervous system. So what's happening from a motor skill development standpoint. And so movement abilities are motor skills. So if we don't have good motor abilities, then we're not going to have good movement skill tasks. If I can't do a task-specific or sport-specific activity, it usually relates back to movement ability. Right. So how can you be a good lacrosse player if you can't run? Right. So it kind of starts there. So I look at that from that lens first. Then I look at, well, if I load that, what does it do to the central nervous system? right? And so if I'm sloppy mechanically, which is one lens that I look at, and I don't have the cardiovascular and metabolic ability to be able to handle all those loads, biochemical or biometabolic, then that's another lens I have to look at. But then I have to look at, well, how do those all come together? And if I'm looking at it from the perspective of, well, if I only have my central nervous system hat on, well, is it the mechanics that are leading to poor motor control? Or if it's, I just don't have the energy to be able to sustain it, and that's affecting the nervous system, where do I start? And that's really the challenge, is trying to determine, well, is it mechanical? Is it the nervous system they just don't know where to put their foot in the ground, right? From a motor task standpoint. And then when I do load it, what is their capacity? Does their nervous system completely fatigue, and then that's what makes them look sloppy? And so really it comes down to, well, I have to give some leniency to something, so I have to test it or screen it or have some sort of observation of it.
Sure.
So I usually start from the first end, I start mechanically. I give them the benefit of the doubt that their nervous system can learn a new task. Because I'm not really challenging them at a very high velocity that would have such a high nervous system demand.
Sure.
That, okay, well, we'll see what your ability is to be able to handle this particular drill. So in that sense, I'll start with joints and how they interact with gravity and the ground first, right? From there, I increase complexity. And if I increase complexity in the motor task demand, then that lets me know what their nervous system can kind of handle. Then I see what's their capacity after that.
Right.
And so if I kind of follow that format, whether it's, okay, first just stationary throwing, then it's, can I throw on the run? Can I throw at different angles? Am I still interacting, and can my arm throw from different positions if I need to? If I'm a handball player, I need to be able to throw from just about anywhere,
everywhere,
right? But if I'm a baseball pitcher, I have a fairly strict motor skill and routine that I stick to when I'm throwing, right?
Right.
Both have their advantages, and some have their massive challenges. To a pitcher, variability is the thing that they need the most,
Right.
And just for health of tissue. And so then we start to layer these different tasks and complexities in terms of what their training load actually is. And so the more skilled they are, and the longer that they've been training, and let's say they're a professional, then their ability to be able to handle complex loads becomes greater and greater because they've had the experience to do so.
Sure.
And so that's really where we look at, I need to have a lens to look at it from a developmental standpoint. Where are they in their motor skills and movements? And then as they start to age and they get into more, let's call it more elite sport or activity, we need to know that, well, they should naturally be able to progress and move at higher velocities, right? And so for me, velocity, the speed at which we move at, is the highest predictor of efficiency, but it's also the highest predictor of injury.
Right.
So if I can't do something, that's me included, I try to continue to move as fast and still train for power even though I'm 42 years old, because I have to be able to demonstrate that for my clients.
Sure.
But I know I can't move at the same velocities that I once did, and if I do, 3 days I'm shot, right? Because I just don't have the capacity to handle it anymore.
Of course.
And so that's what we look for, I think, in designing our training programs, is give the highest level of attention to the central nervous system, and before we actually look at increasing load mechanically.
Right.
Because the load that you add mechanically will have an impact on the central nervous system. So if I do, for example, high velocity sprints over distances, right? So obviously the 100 meter and 200 meter are probably the most taxing sprint, right? If I do a lot of repetitive 100 meter sprints, these guys are going to be destroyed, right? Or these girls are going to be destroyed. But if I take them in the gym and I do a power clean with them, high CNS effect, but not near as much as sprinting.
Right.
So there has to be a scalable effect of how much of this stuff I do. So that's why I use submaximal loading, and that's why VIPR PRO is great, is I can now still tax their movement system, but with a submaximal load and a very submaximal velocity. So that allows me to balance out that sport specific velocity I need to move at, and then balance it out so that they have a bit of a homeostasis, right?
So you see the VIPR as kind of that bridge between the development of the movement skill and the specificity of skill and being able to load it and make that bridge between the two.
100%, 100%. And that's what's so cool about it, is that I can take that tool, put it on end, do a shuffling tilting pattern, and use that tool as an external reference for how their foot needs to get in the ground. Right? And so now they're not thinking about their foot. They can drive their hand at the same time as they drive their foot, and they can get that recoil that they need to get off the ground.
Right. And it's fun.
It becomes one of those things that they, it's purposeful. And again, there it goes to being task specific, right? It's not lifting this weights for this many reps for this many sets.
Right. So you'd say the secret to training is train the general movement skills, the universal set of movement skills first, and then as those get more well-defined, start loading them, speed, weight, and other forces and such, and frequency and amplitudes and all that type of thing, and then start working towards those specific skills that the individual needs for, say, their baseball career or their skating career or whatnot, and try to build the athlete that way and try to make it fun all at the same time.
Yeah, and I think that the trick behind it is trying to find out when is that athlete ready for that level of specificity and velocity. And because most kids don't have an off season now, at least, well, in Canada we had to. You couldn't play baseball in the winter and you couldn't play hockey in the summer, right? Well, they can now.
Yeah, they can. Yeah, sure.
It shouldn't happen that way. And so when I talk to off seasons for a lot of kids, they'll go, "Oh yeah, I had like a week off at Christmas time."
Right.
It's not an off season. Off means you don't put a racket in your hand, right? But if I can develop that in that way, then we can introduce the appropriate loads at the appropriate times for their individual development, and not based on age group, which is like, your date of issue, right? Which is, you came out September 1983, that means you're ready to go play this. It doesn't work that way.
Right.
And that's the fault of sport and administrators, is organizing things that way.
But you're asking everybody to start looking at things from the long-term sustainability of that athlete, and ultimately the long-term health and welfare of that athlete, growing past their sport even.
Yeah, well, because we're seeing some of the greatest athletes in the world are playing now beyond their 40s, which we never thought of that before. But it's because they're thinking about balancing everything out, right?
Yeah. Fantastic. Well, we'll put the links to John's stuff and the VIPR Pro and everything down in the descriptions and such. Where is the best place they can get a hold of you and get information from you?
Yeah, they can email me at johnny@vipr.com. So JOHNNY@VIPR.com. That's a great way just to email me. It's a little more personal response. You can follow me on Instagram, which is Authentic Health Coach. And it's probably 2 easy ways to get a hold of me.
All right, fantastic. Thank you very much.
Thank you so
Appreciate
much.
it, and look forward to hearing from you again soon.
Awesome. Anytime.
Awesome. Thank you.